Welcome to the Onset podcast, where we discuss science-based breathing tools and practices to optimize your health. Hi everyone, I'm your host, Matthew Chafford, biomedical engineer and health tech podcaster. Our guest today is Dean Stott, who is a mental health activist and author, having dealt with and recovered from anxiety disorder himself. Dean has founded the online community of support DLC Anxiety, which gathers millions of people across the globe and offers a space where individuals can learn and share from each other's journey through anxiety. In this conversation, Dean shares his personal experience with panic attacks and how he overcame them. He emphasizes the importance of psychoeducation and breathwork, explaining how panic attacks relate to the fight-or-flight response, and the role of breathwork in addressing panic attacks at their onset or as a preventive measure. We talk about diaphragmatic breathing, and the importance of incorporating breathwork into daily routines as a tool to manage and prevent panic attacks. By the end of this episode, you will know simple breathing techniques that you can use in your daily life to prevent and manage panic attacks if you have any. Before we jump right in, I'd like to add that this episode is brought to you by Oxa, the first wearable with live biofeedback and your coach for enhanced sleep and stress relief. Oxa measures in real time your vitals, like your heart and respiratory rates, and creates personalized breathing protocols for you to control stress and get better sleep. Head over to oxalife.com, that's oxalife.com, for more details on how Oxa can help you live a healthier life. And now, here's our conversation with Dean Stott. Welcome to the Onset podcast, Dean. It's very great. It's a great opportunity to have you here on the show. Took some time to set it up, but we're there. And so the main topic, I think, for today, we actually did an episode with someone called Ryan Carroll in the past on anxiety. And we thought this one we would be, more talking about panic attacks, which is, it's related to anxiety, but we haven't explored the role of breathwork with panic attacks. And I think, we would be probably, one of the best persons to address that topic. So I think the first question I'd like to kind of start the conversation and to anchor a bit, the episode is maybe related drawing from your personal story. So, what is your personal experience with panic attacks? If you can share that with us.
Yeah, of course. So firstly, thank you so much for inviting me onto the podcast. I love everything that you guys are doing. It's a great pleasure to be on here and sharing the education. So if people don't know, I'm the founder of DLC Anxiety, an online community with over 2.3 million community members across social media. I founded it back in 2018 after I'd overcome my own panic disorder. So I had 2 years of going through panic attacks, mostly every day, going into shopping centres, going into restaurants, local places, and I would deal with these panic attacks, and it was a real hard time for me. My safe space became smaller and smaller, as it does when you're dealing with panic attacks. But I overcame it, and I wanted to share my story that if you're feeling isolated, you're feeling alone, that there is hope and that you can overcome it. I'm just a regular person who overcame it by curating the correct tools and having the correct community support, having the correct support around me. And I wanted to share that message, so I started to share that on DLC Anxiety. So yeah, my panic attack started after the death of my father. So like anybody, any male, I would say, I sort of kept the emotions in and started to go back to work, try to get back to some kind of norm. And lo and behold, 2 or 3 months later, all that excessive stress, all of that unprocessed grief ended up coming out in a huge panic attack, one that I'd never experienced a panic attack before. I felt like there was something completely wrong with me. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know that it was anxiety. And yeah, I was very scared. I thought that there was something seriously wrong with my body. And that's what really kick-started the panic disorder, because I then started to become fearful of having that experience again. And every time I got that experience, I became more fearful, not only of experiencing it, but also the unknown of not knowing what it was. So it was an ongoing battle of going through that and being too scared to go to the doctors at the time to try and seek the help, of worrying that there was something seriously wrong with me. So it took a lot of courage and strength to make that first step to go to the doctors. And I remember them sitting me down. We'd done a blood test. I was thinking that it was going to come back as something was seriously wrong. and they told me that it was anxiety, and I couldn't believe what they were saying to me. I was like, anxiety? What do you mean? I'm not worried or nervous about anything. And they said, oh, well, we think that you've been experiencing panic attacks. What they prescribed for me, I was expecting medication, I was expecting maybe some therapy, but they prescribed a library card to get a specific library book on panic attacks. I felt dismissed. I thought, they're not taking me seriously, there's something seriously wrong. But I went and got the book, and then I sat down, I started to read the book, read the process of what anxiety and panic attacks were, and the cycle of anxiety and the cycle of panic, and the symptoms, physical and emotional symptoms of panic attacks. And that really kick-started my recovery of taking away that unknown of what anxiety and panic is, and almost like arming me with some knowledge that then could help me on that journey to recovery.
First of all, thank you for sharing, your personal story with it. I understood it took, 2 years to resolve. So that's a fairly large amount of time, I would say, when you know what a panic attack is. Can you explain to us, because I guess for some of the listeners, they will relate, will be able to, because they've experienced it. For some who might not have experienced it, luckily, can you share with us what happens in the body during a panic attack? Like, what are the physiological mechanisms at play, and how does that, manifest itself?
Yeah, certainly. So firstly, there's no one size fits all. A panic attack is the fight or flight response that's kicking in. So when we have anxiety, we have this fight or flight response that kicks in. It's an extreme rush of adrenaline and the stress hormone cortisol that rushes through the body and creates these extreme responses to a threat that your brain and body perceives to be there. The thing with a panic attack is that there is no danger there. So what you find is that you're put in this situation where your body's giving you all these chemicals, all this rush of emotion, all these physiological and emotional changes, but there's actually no danger in your surroundings. So what happens is the mind starts to look inwards and thinks, oh, well, maybe what I'm experiencing, maybe this is the danger. And that's where you can start to then become fearful of panic attacks. But yeah, it can happen out of the blue. You could just be maybe triggered by being in a certain situation of what you're fearful of, or maybe in a situation where you've had a panic attack before. And it can also occur when anxiety builds up over a process of time. So you sitting with the anxiety, but then you're becoming fearful of the anxiety, and it'll build up, and then it reaches that peak of a panic attack. So it can express itself in many ways. But yes, the best way to explain panic attacks is that it's the extreme response of anxiety, that final fight or flight, that final adrenaline dump, as you would call it. Yeah, it can leave you very, very scared and very, very exhausted after it happens.
And we talk about, I guess, there are different durations, like, how long does it last? Is it like a few seconds? Is it a few minutes? I guess it's very variable. And you talked about the triggers as well. From your experience, were you able to recognize the triggers? Because I understand that the first time it happens, you don't know what happens, right? Like, you're like, what is this reaction of my body? There are no real rational, threats, and still you're having, heart rate goes up, pressure goes up, and kind of like the world seems to fall down. So yeah, can you share a bit, from your experience there?
Yeah, of course. So what I would say with the duration is that if you're looking at it, no panic attack really is going to last longer than 20 minutes, really. It's a physiological and emotional response. But what happens is that can happen, but then the body can then reignite anxiety from what you're feeling. And it can feel like you're in a continuous loop. So you can have one panic attack, and then the anxiety starts to come down, but then you can be triggered and have another panic attack. Or you can have a panic attack and maybe pull yourself out of that situation. And I'm sure we're going to speak about some of the helpful tools that people can use. You could feel a panic attack come on if you had the right tool, but you could then really reduce that anxiety and come out of it maybe in a few minutes, maybe in less than a minute if you have knowledge of this. But yeah, regarding myself and knowing the triggers, it's really a catch-22 too, because when you first deal with a panic attack, as any response from what your mind thinks is danger, you start to avoid that situation. So if we give the example of me being in a shopping centre, I have a panic attack, I then innately start to avoid putting myself in that situation of being in the shopping centre because I'm fearful of a panic attack occurring. And what that does though is it increases this learned behaviour habit within the brain that teaches your mind that every time that you step in a shopping centre that is dangerous. And what happens then is that you find that the next time you go into a shopping centre, lo and behold, that anxiety then comes. And you can really find yourself getting in this loop of avoiding the situations of where the anxiety occurs in order to protect yourself. Now, this may work temporarily, but what it does, it starts to shrink your safe space. So somebody who may be going to shopping centres may then avoid the shopping centre. But the problem is that then while they're driving around or near the shopping centre, they may feel anxiety and then they may start to avoid driving. And then it can really get to a really limited space of some people where they find it very hard to get out of their bedrooms. And some people in extreme cases can really find it hard to get out of their beds because they're in fear of having another panic attack and having another anxiety. So yeah, it can really limit that space and really have a detrimental impact on your social, emotional, and obviously mental health.
And you mentioned, on your way to recovery that, there was a sort of like a pivotal reading that you did to understand a bit, what panic attacks are and how you can, get out of them. The whole thing about this podcast, the OXA podcast, is we try to understand, what's the role and what's the impact of breathwork on many different things in our life. And we can probably, get to that point later to understand, okay, what are some of the practices that can be useful for dealing with panic attacks, be it, I guess, to prevent them or to manage them when you're, in the middle of an event. What are the solutions then without, specifically looking into breathwork yet? How did you get away from those events?
That's a great question. So the solution is not, unfortunately, a light switch where you can switch it on and off. I wish it was. I mean, it would make my job a lot easier if I could say, yes, you just do this one thing and then you don't deal with a panic attack. Unfortunately, the solution is a long process for many people. It's a commitment for many people. It's a surrendering to the anxiety and to the panic attacks. But there is so many different options that you can choose and so many tools available that can help you with anxiety and panic. So the great news for anyone who's dealing with it and feeling isolated and feeling alone is that there is so many different tools they can try to help them. And like I said earlier, it's not a one size fits all. So what might work best for me may look a little different for you. So it's about curating your own toolkit to help you in that situation. And some of the things like we mentioned that's very good is the psychoeducation about anxiety and panic. It takes away that fear of the unknown. What is anxiety? It's a fear of the future, fear of the unknown, fear of the what ifs. So when you're anxious, you have these what if thoughts. It takes away that fear because you learn about the bodily process. You learn about the physiology and the emotional process of anxiety, but also the main part is actually the doing. So being courageous enough to put yourself back into the situations of where the anxiety and the panic attacks are occurring, even though that is your body's telling you that that's the wrong thing to do. Your body is telling you to avoid that situation, and that's okay because your body is programmed to do that. Your body is just doing what it's been built to do if there was a danger there. But we need to remind yourself that the situation that you're in is not dangerous. And if it isn't a dangerous situation, I encourage people to really try and put themselves back into those situations where the anxiety and panic attacks occur, because what they will find is when they start to do it at first, of course, the anxiety and panic is going to come back. But if you can maybe stay in that situation for 5 minutes or even 2 minutes the first time, as opposed to avoiding the situation, then that's a win. And you should really document that down and document your successes and start to create this inner narrative of taking the right steps of improvement. And this is what we call exposure therapy. It's a CBT technique, and it can be done in two ways. Gradual exposure, where we would build it up. So we would start off maybe 1 or 2 minutes in that situation, see how the feeling is with the anxiety, and then build it up over time. Or we have flooded exposure, which is what I personally did, which is you just put yourself into that situation and sit with the uncomfortable feelings of the anxiety and the panic. Know that the panic and the anxiety is going to come, but stay in that situation because you know that no matter what feelings that you feel, and you're still safe. It's just a bodily response. It's just a misfiring of this safety response. So when you keep yourself in that situation and you do this over time repetitively, all the scientific studies, all the research shows and suggests that people can then start to rewire the brain to tell them that the situations where this anxiety and panic attacks occur are not dangerous. And what you see over time is a reduction in the anxiety and eventually a reduction in the frequency of the panic attacks.
And, among these set of tools, and because I understand it requires a holistic approach, to identify triggers and to get onto this journey of, recovery, what is the role of, breathwork in helping to address, I guess, partly panic attacks? Where does it help? Where does it not help? Can you share a bit your knowledge there?
I can, yeah. So breathwork is a very, very interesting topic, especially when we speak in the anxiety community, because you do get some pushback from some of the community members who say, well, when I'm dealing with anxiety, I'm dealing with panic. The last thing I can do is focus on my breath. Because when I focus on my breath, what happens is I get more anxious because I'm being told that I need to focus on my breath. It's not working, and now that's creating more anxiety because it's not working. So I often hear stories of people being frustrated in them situations, but we know that the evidence with breathwork is that it has an incredible effect on taking someone firstly out of a panic attack. If you're in the middle of a panic attack, if you use breathwork correctly, they can really take you out of that situation. But also more importantly, this even before the panic attacks occur. So we actually don't realize that when we're anxious and we're storing this anxiety, we're actually breathing incorrectly. We're often hyperventilating and breathing through the chest instead of the diaphragmatic breathing that we should be doing from the belly. Belly breathwork techniques and learning to breathe from the diaphragm is really helpful because it gets us from that fight or flight stage to the rest and digest. So it can take us from one extreme and it can literally really switch it back into another, reduce the heart rate at the time, which then reduces the anxiety and reduces that physiological response. But the most importantly is, for me, is that you use it as a tool to help you on a daily basis. So you start doing this breath work when the panic attacks are not there. Start this breath work as part of your routine. When you get up in the morning, you have some space to learn how to breathe correctly, how you should be breathing from the belly. And when you start to sharpen that tool and learn how to do it correctly, and it becomes one of your daily habits, you start to realize that you're breathing correctly without even knowing. That's where you really have a great effect on your overall anxiety. Because, like I said, it is often people don't realize that they're breathing incorrectly when they're in a heightened level of stress and anxiety.
And these are techniques that how did you come to learn about them? Like, was it through the book that you've read? Was it through, therapies you went through after you recognized that you were suffering from panic attacks? Can you share with us that?
When I was reading the book, that was mainly focusing on the psychoeducation of the panic attacks and not really the tools of how to get over them. So that was almost a searching of my own. And I remember one of the best things I did was I was speaking to a colleague at the time where I was working, and I just shared that I was dealing with anxiety. And when I opened up and started to discuss with them where I was feeling isolated, alone and trapped, they actually started to tell me the feelings and sensations I was feeling. And I didn't realize that they had actually been through anxiety and dealt with panic attacks themselves. So just being open and honest to a friend who was working with me, I learned that I'm not alone, I'm not isolated, and actually more people are dealing with this than I know. And it was my friend at the time that shared breath work and meditation work was really helpful for them. So it was almost like this self-exploration and one thing's for sure is if you're dealing with anxiety and you have a lot of anxiety, there's no stone that is left unturned when you're trying to come out of that situation. People with anxiety are looking for a solution all the time. So they're often searching on all forums, which can be good and bad because we can get fixated on the wrong things. But when you go down the right and look at the right material, you can start to see the correct self-help things that can help you. So I started to look at YouTube's of correct breathing, and I was actually very lucky to get a breathwork coach onto the DLC Live podcast who spoke about how breathwork is really helpful in helping anxiety. So he was a psychiatrist at the time who said that is the number one tool. When in the middle of a panic attack, if you can switch your breathing and go into the diaphragmatic breathing, slow down that breathing, which slows down that heart rate, you're going to be able to get yourself out of a panic attack in that situation.
There's also an element of, enabling prevention of those events, maybe up to the point where they don't appear anymore. Then you talked about diaphragmatic breathing instead of breathing through the chest, which is maybe like a natural reaction of the body to compensate for your heart rate increases, your oxygen needs, and breathing pattern is impacted. Can you share with us some exercises that you started to implement on your journey toward recovery that helped you reach that stage where you could actually prevent those events or massively reduce their frequency or their amount?
Of course. So I remember when I was first reading it, I didn't even know what belly breathing was. I had no idea what it was. So I was thinking, how can I do this correctly? And one of the things that I came across was a fantastic technique that anyone can do. All you need is a book. And I laid myself flat on the floor or on a bed, and I placed the book on my belly. And as I inhaled, the book would rise. And as the book rises to the top, you hold it for a few seconds. And then as you exhale, the book goes back down. And that was a real good technique, a real easy technique just to learn and teach the anchoring and grounding as well, and the mindfulness that is in breathwork as well, of being in that moment and doing the correct technique. So like I said, I sharpened this tool and started to do this in moments where I was not anxious. And by sharpening that tool, when it came to a panic attack, obviously I didn't need the book there because I already knew what that technique was and I was able to implement it. And all you need is that one time of when you implement it in a situation, say in a shopping center, and the anxiety reduces, then that really can kickstart the recovery, because that's showing the brain the evidence that it's seeking that, hey, this technique works, this tool works. Maybe there is an outcome where we can overcome this anxiety. So yeah, it was a lot of practice, and like I say, I can't stress enough that a lot of the hard work has to be done when it comes from, in my personal opinion, has to be done in a non-anxious state. Because if you're asking someone in the middle of an anxiety or panic attack to start to do breathing that they don't have any knowledge of what to do, they're going to become more anxious, they're going to become more frustrated, and they're going to probably not then do it and have this false bias that it doesn't work for them. So I would really stress that if you're dealing with anxiety and panic and you've maybe tried it before, please try it in the morning or in a non-anxious state, and try and curate in a safe environment where there is no anxiety, because that's where you can learn and sharpen the tool to be able to then use it when panic attacks occur.
I'd like to get back to something you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation regarding some of the reactions you get from the community when you talk about breathwork, and people tell you, well, when I have a panic attack, it's impossible for me, or it's actually detrimental to me to think about, controlling my breath because it's out of control and I don't manage it, and it's even more anxious and panicked to try to control it. So how do you approach that with people who have that type of reaction, which I think is very, understandable and legit? How do you not convince them, but, change a bit the thinking so that they can actually, leverage those techniques? Because they have, from what I understand from the experience you've shared, they have a great value.
No, 100%. And this is where platforms such as Instagram can be very, very beneficial, because we can all share, like you say, our stories. This is why we do the podcast. This is why we sit down and share our experiences, because in experience there is education. And when we go through something, obviously that is knowledge for other people as well. So going through it myself and learning the techniques myself, and being in a situation where I tried to implement breathing and it didn't work, and then learning that no, you need to learn these tools when you're not in an anxious or panic state, and then being able to share that story that yes, when I first tried, I failed. When I first tried, I didn't think it would work. But when I then implemented it in a different way, I then started to get these results. I think there is something special when you are authentic and you're telling your own personal story. I think that really connects with your audience. So I just think that the transparency of showing people that it's okay to fail. It's okay that if you've tried it maybe 1, 2, 3 times and it hasn't worked, that doesn't mean that it's never going to work. Try and implement it in a different way. Maybe try and look at different techniques that you've done, then try again. Because when we look at the evidence of breathwork and we know that you implement it correctly, we know that it can be hugely beneficial for someone who's dealing with anxiety and panic.
One thing also I wanted to ask you, I just thought about, you speak to a community of 2.3 million people. That's that's the number. And I guess it's just, it keeps increasing over time. I was wondering if you could share, some of the insights that you have in terms of the origins of those, of those panic attacks. Is there a trend? Because the background to my question is that we talked about anxiety with Rand Carroll in episode 4. We talked about, stress management with Dave Wood in episode 1. And there was, a lot of the elements that cause stress or anxiety is due to, the way kind of like the modern life and, exposure to certain things like, social media, or just like being in a very stressful and, constantly very demanding environment. Can you share with us, have you seen any sort of like trends that, things that you would say, well, these are things happening at the moment that are actually leading to a lot of panic attacks or a lot of like acute anxiety cases that people might relate to? Or I was wondering if you could share.
Yeah, so my number one take on this would be from my own personal experience and also the evidence of how and why panic attacks and excessive anxiety occurs, is the huge link to excessive stress. So like you said, you mentioned social media, you mentioned the daily stresses of, well, we've been through everything. We've been through a pandemic, we've been through all the financial difficulties that's going on in the world, all the wars, all these things that are happening, all these things have an impact on us. We pick up our phones and we are bombarded with negativity from the second that we wake up because of the addiction that we have towards the smartphone. All these things really build up. So it's these external stresses that we have, all these external stresses that have built up over time. So then if you have something like a major life event, for example, like myself, who had the passing of my father, that can then really almost have an overflow of your, we call it a stress bucket. So we have a bucket and then we have all the daily stresses that build up in there. And then eventually all those daily stresses need to go out somewhere. They need an outlet. And when they start to overflow, that's when they normally start to overflow with excessive anxiety, and that's where panic attacks can occur. So yeah, we're often with major life events, we can be very triggering. One thing that I found very interesting was that those major life events don't need to be negative. So it doesn't need to be a death. Obviously, the negative ones have obviously a detrimental impact. But also positive life changes can still cause excessive anxiety. So positive ones could be things such as a job promotion. It could be things such as a wedding, a new baby. It could be things of relocation. Anything that gives added stress to the already overflowing stress bucket that we have can then really kickstart excessive anxiety. And then when we have the excessive anxiety, one thing that I've seen as a common denominator within the community is that when people have that extreme anxiety, they often become scared of those physical sensations because they are very heightened, they're very scary for people who've never dealt with it before. So then they start to become fearful of those physical sensations. And then when they start to become fearful, they start to do the avoidance techniques, which then obviously starts to limit them in society, in relationships, and their friends, and it can really have a detrimental effect. So yeah, when you start to see excessive anxiety occurring, I would recommend to everyone to start to look at your external stresses and look at the stresses, the ones that are in your control. How can you start to reduce stress from that stress bucket? There's going to be things that are out of your control, obviously. Those are the things that we can try to change, because if we try to change something that's out of our control, that's just going to cause more anxiety. But there's going to be things in that stress bucket that you can start to look at and start to implement ways of reducing your stress levels. And I believe that if you start to implement this and start to reduce your stress over time, that will have a real positive effect on excessive anxiety and help you go from that fight or flight mode back to a more equal state.
Thanks a lot. Obviously it's a heavy topic, and you interact on a daily basis with thousands, hundreds of thousands of people going through this. What keeps you hopeful, or what gives you the energy to keep doing what you do, educating and helping people facing the problem? Because the problem is massive. You talk to a community of millions of people, but I think it's probably hundreds of millions. I don't know how many. I don't have any numbers in mind of people who are dealing with anxiety, but I think from what I had read for the episode with Ryan Carroll, numbers are massive. So I was wondering, what keeps you hopeful and what drives your energy to tackle that heavy topic?
Yes, so many things. So when I overcame the anxiety and panic, I had this burning desire to try and how could I spread this message to as many people as possible? Because I know a guy was there. I felt isolated. I felt alone. I felt like I would never overcome anxiety and panic. I felt like that was me. So when I actually overcame that, I wanted to tell as many people as possible. That's where I came across Instagram. And I came across there was only a few accounts at the time that were sharing their stories on anxiety. People who'd been through anxiety and panic attacks, and they were just being vulnerable and sharing the story. And I thought, this is a wonderful place to be able to share my story. So I started to do that. And what I've seen over the years now from them 3 people, if you just type in the word anxiety just into Instagram alone, you will see, I would say, over 100, maybe 200 accounts now on anxiety. So to me, that shows improvement, because all from spoken word, all from people talking in these communities. So that has been a huge driving factor for showing that we're having a real change in real life. Do you know what I mean? We see it over the years when we look on it, and we see more and more people talking about anxiety. And then obviously, like you say, I speak to so many people on a daily basis. I get some of the most beautiful emails or direct messages from people who said, if it wasn't for your account, then I wouldn't be here. So those messages, no matter how bad your day is, no matter what you're going through, I could be having the worst day of my life. If I turn on my computer and I read something like that, that just shows that everything is worthwhile, because that really shows the direct impacts that you're having on an individual. And yeah, seeing the success stories as well from the community members, it just never gets old. It is really interesting, because people, when they're in the middle of an anxiety disorder, they're often saying, how do I get the old me back? How do I get to before I was dealing with anxiety? But people, when they've overcome an anxiety disorder, they would never want to go back to that original person, because there is so much growth and knowledge and learning and experience from that. They become a better person overall. So seeing that growth within people and then seeing them share the knowledge is, they're just a beautiful thing. My drive is to try and continue this message and try and get it to people of a younger generation. So try and get it to children, because I think psychoeducation and, like I say, these conversations and community talks can be beneficial from a very young age. And I think we should be doing more of trying to tackle it from a younger age. So I would say that is a goal of mine that I've been working on over the last year or so, to try and make an impact with the younger generation as well.
I think it's a very honorable mission, and I probably also agree, that the younger generation, they're even more exposed to some of these causes that, we've talked about, social media or, extremely connected world. And let's see, how the world looks like in a few years or a few months. But yeah, there are also like these geopolitical tensions and everything that adds to the mix that's a bit of quite scary, to be honest. You mentioned you created your account 2018. That's 6 years ago. It's not that long ago. And I also appreciate quite a lot the focus that's being placed these days on mental health in general for people like you and me. I think in other areas like in sports and there's like a big emphasis on bringing awareness on those topics, and I think it's very very helpful. It also creates a bit more like a human world where you see also what are the limits of people that potentially are presented as achievers or that seem to not have so many physical limits. So we did like I think we covered quite some ground. You introduced us to your personal story, where your panic attacks were coming from, and I think it was very personal. So I thank you for sharing this with so much transparency and openness. We talked about the reaction, how it manifests itself, some of the solutions to panic attacks, and the role of breathwork in that space. And I appreciate as well that you shared a very concrete example for belly breathing with the book, because as you said, like I'm still fairly new to like breathwork, but when I heard about the distinction between diaphragmatic breathing, belly breathing, it's not very clear. And so if you can have some kind of a visual reference as this exercise enables, I think it's super practical. And it's anyone has a book at home, and anyone can lay with a book on her or his belly. So it's very actionable, very simple. So thanks a lot for that. I don't know if you want to add anything to this before our closing question.
Yeah, like I said, I just don't give up hope. Even though your mind is telling you that you're not going to overcome this, that you're going to be stuck in this trap, just know that thoughts are not facts. And when you're dealing with anxiety, those thoughts are often very, I would say you just don't take any notice of them. It's okay to acknowledge that they're there. I wouldn't say try and avoid those thoughts, because when we try to avoid the thoughts, our brain then says, hey, why are we trying to avoid these thoughts, and starts to produce more anxiety thoughts. So acknowledge your thoughts, label them as anxious thoughts, but try not to get entangled with them. So try not to start a narrative with them. Just let them sit there and let them flow through the consciousness, just like the thousands of other thoughts that you have on a daily basis that you pay no attention to, but you just acknowledge and you see them there. So I say treat thoughts, I call it like a thought river. So as you're looking at the river and you're seeing the water flowing down the river, imagine that's all your different types of thoughts, and the content of the thoughts really don't matter. It's the meaning that we put on those thoughts that then creates the anxiety.
Thanks a lot. So our closing question that we ask every guest on the show is, if we would move away from, let's say, panic attacks or things or anxiety in general, what is like one breathing practice that you would recommend everyone adopt in their daily lives? That's not the book belly breathing one that you've already shared.
So anchoring and focusing on the breath. So when we're dealing, for example, with anything to do with mental health, our mind is elsewhere. We're often lost in this inner narrative, this inner dialogue. When we think of the breath, it is such a great grounding tool because it can bring us back into the present moment. It can anchor us away from those thoughts that I just mentioned before. Yes, the thoughts are still there, but know that they're there, and we can bring our attention back to the breath. So I would say that the breath is a fantastic way to anchor and ground yourself and be mindful in the situation. And we know that being mindful in the situation and sitting with the anxiety and sitting with that uncomfortable feeling and focusing all the energy on the breath instead of the inner narrative, instead of the physical sensations, that can help to reduce the anxiety as well.
Thank you so much, Dean. We'll make sure that we, put in the show notes all the resources that you mentioned, the book, a link also like to the other techniques that you've mentioned. So thank you so much for your time and for coming on the show and sharing with us with openness your your experience with Breathwork, panic attacks, and keep doing what you do.
Thank you so much. And again, my thanks goes to you guys for everything that you're doing. It's been wonderful to share your story and just everything that you guys are doing from a scientific base and all the evidence that you guys are showing. And I really think you're a game changer where it comes to breathwork and evaluating and looking at the statistics in a healthy and balanced way. That's what I love for my community. And that's why I think it's been great showcasing what you guys are doing, because I think it's just different from any of your competitors. So yeah, I think you're a Swiss company, is that correct?
It's Swiss, yeah.
Yeah, so there was no doubt that it was going to be a good product. So yeah.
Precise like the Swiss watches.
Exactly.
Thanks so much, Dean.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our conversation with Dean Stott, where we discuss breathing tools to prevent and manage panic attacks. To learn more about and explore the resources that Dean mentioned, please check out the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode of the Oxo Podcast, subscribe on YouTube or your preferred listening platform and give us feedback via email using podcast@oxolife.com or in the comment section. Feel free to also share topic suggestions and guest recommendations for the next episodes. If you know someone who would benefit from today's conversation, please share the episode with this person. As an additional way to support the show, you can leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It really helps us a lot in bringing the podcast forward. Thanks for listening to today's episode and for your interest in the science of breathing.